What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back. As always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel. It's NFL free agency, so we're here to break it all down before it kicks off for the Green Bay Packers with everything you need to know before it starts. But first, you know what to do. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com and download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, radio, everything you need. So like I said, it's Monday morning. NFL's legal tampering period starts later this afternoon, or later this morning, I should say. And this is where teams can begin negotiating with outside free agents and even agree to terms on a contract. However, it does not become official until Wednesday, when the NFL's free agency period officially opens. So we're going to dive through a couple of topics that you need to know and, of course, are relevant to the Green Bay Packers. So let's start with their salary cap situation because, of course, that's going to impact what they have available to them to spend. According to Over the Cap, the Packers currently have $42.78 million in available cap space. In terms of spending power, that ranks 18th in the NFL, so right around the middle of the pack in that regard. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with that number, just under $43 million in cap space, not all of that is available to the Packers to spend. There are other salary cap expenses that are going to be coming down the pipeline, and this is true for every team, not only the Green Bay Packers, but some of those additional expenses that are going to eat up salary cap space in 2025 include signing their draft class. And based on where their draft picks are, Over the Cap projects that will take up $3.1 million in salary cap space. Some other expenses are assembling the practice squad. The 52nd and 53rd players on the roster have to be accounted for during the offseason. That salary cap figure is based on just the top 51 contracts on each team in terms of salary cap hit. And of course, as we all know, there's 53 players on a roster. So there's two additional players who are going to have to be accounted for against the salary cap. In addition to those two expenses, every team needs in-season reserves. Now that number can fluctuate depending on what the team wants to have available, but for expenses such as, elevating a player from the practice squad, going from the practice squad salary for a week to the active game day roster for a week, that's cap space. In-season additions, and I know the Packers don't always make a ton of those, but we've seen it throughout the years, right? Jared Valdir, Whitney Merciless, players that they sign along the way throughout the season. So, of course, you need cap space for that as well. So, and there are other expenses, but to get a general idea of what that ballpark amount is of additional cap space that's coming down the road for this Packers team, again, $3.1 million. It's going to have to be devoted to this year's draft class. Ken Ingalls, terrific Twitter follow, breaks all this Packers salary cap information down, makes it extremely digestible. He's accounted by his own projections, his own calculations, what these additional cap costs are going to be. And by his numbers, he's got to $13.15 million, again, plus the $3.1 million for the draft class. So that's roughly $16 million in additional cap expenses that the Packers are going to have available this upcoming season. So they don't have $43 million in cap space to spend. Realistically, they're probably closer to 26-ish million in terms of spending power this offseason. That's what they have available to them. Now, there are means, and we've talked about this in a previous video, when it comes to creating additional cap space. One of those avenues, and the Packers did this a lot during the 2021, 2022 off seasons, is restructuring contracts. I'm not going to get into the weeds of that here, but in short, it's taking salary cap charges from the current year and kicking that can down the road. You push them to future years of the contract. The benefit, obviously, in the short term, you create cap space, right? The downside is those cap charges have to come due at some point. They don't just magically disappear. So the player's cap hit in future years has now increased. So that's the pros and cons to that decision making. Having said that, it feels like, just given where we are right now on the cusp of free agency starting, I don't know that we're going to see the Packers explore that option. For one, I think in general, that's not a path teams want to go down, right? Like as an example, it's kind of like spending on your credit card, right? It's pushing the cap charges to future years, whereas if you have the money in savings, you'd probably rather go that route. So I don't necessarily think the Packers are going to go down that route. I think if they were going to, we would have seen it happen already. And as Brian Gutekunst said, that's not necessarily a path they want to lean heavily on either. They did so in previous years to keep that crew together out of necessity. And Brian Gutekunst said after the season, if the right player is available and we have to do that type of cap maneuvering to make it work, they're of course going to do that. But it's not the preferred method for operation. And the Packers, cap-wise, are sitting in a pretty good spot overall. So again, that is an avenue. It's still available to them. We could see them go down that path, but I just don't know if we're going to at this time. Another cap-saving maneuver would be trading or releasing Jair Alexander, which would free up $6.8 million in additional salary cap space for the Packers this offseason. So that's where things currently stand. Again, what we need to know, they have $42.78 million in available cap space according to Over the Cap. In terms of what they actually have to spend here in free agency specifically, I would say it's closer to the $26 million mark. And again, you can still go and get some pretty good players with that amount of cap space. But it's just worth noting that, again, when we see these cap numbers floating out there, that's not all on the table for them to spend right now, today, in this week, as they look to add to their roster. All right, now let's get into who the Packers' own in-house free agents are this offseason. They've already resigned 2 of them. Last week it was reported, and the Packers made official, that they've brought back kicker Brandon McManus, signed him to a 3-year deal worth $15.3 million. They also re-signed linebacker Isaiah McDuffie to a 2-year deal that pays out a max amount of $9.5 million. Bringing back McManus, no-brainer, obvious decision. Even right after the season ended, Brian Gutekunst made it pretty well known that that was the Packers' intentions. He provided stability at a position where they had none of it until he returned. During last year's calendar year, from the January of 2024 to when McManus was signed in October of 2024, the Packers had 6 kickers on the roster in some capacity last season before adding McManus to the mix. So it brings obvious stability to the position, no-brainer signing. Isaiah McDuffie, in terms of why did the Packers prioritize bringing him back, core special teams contributor, someone defensively that you can rely on heavily if needed. You can have Isaiah McDuffie out there taking starting snaps if injuries occur. Now, again, he's not going to be one of your starters. You got Quay Walker, you got Edrin Cooper as your starting nickel. Now, when it comes to that third linebacker role, when they're in their base defense, roughly 20-25% of the snaps each game, Isaiah McDuffie can compete with Tyron Hopper for those defensive snaps. But at a minimum, you're getting a player who's going to be a core special teams contributor for you and someone who you can rely on, who has starting experience, who can step in if injuries strike, or if Tyron Hopper is not taking that step in year 2 that the Packers hope for, you have Isaiah McDuffie there to provide depth and to be able to lean on. Now, the other Packers free agents that they have that look like, at least at this time, are going to hit the open market, there are 9 others. And I've done several videos here where I've gone through my predictions, right? And I have article versions over at ESPNlacrosse.com going through all these predictions. And what I really try to do is put myself as best I can in Brian Gutekunst's shoes and think through, all right, if he's going to re-sign this player, what's the reason? If he's not going to re-sign this player, what's the reason for that? And then we make a prediction at the end. Obviously, I'm not going to go through in that level of detail with all these players, but I'll run through each of them with what my prediction is. Tyler Davis, tight end, missed last season with a shoulder injury, also missed the season before with an ACL injury. I think I went a bit off script here. I think he's going to be re-signed. Reason I say that, core special teams contributor. When he suffered the knee injury 2 years ago, Rich Bisaccia said it was something to the effect of losing their right hand. Like, he is that crucial of a player on special teams for them. I understand we are now a few years removed from that because of other injuries, but I also think the other factor involved here is he's a pretty good blocker, and I think he can compete and push Ben Sims for that blocking specific role. Before Tyler Davis's injury last training camp, I thought without question he was the better player on the football field, especially from a blocking perspective, adds versatility as well compared to Ben Sims. So I think for those 2 reasons, special teams, blocking ability to compete with Ben Sims, I think that's a reason that the Green Bay Packers bring him back. Eric Wilson. Now, I will say, I made this prediction obviously before knowing that Isaiah McDuffie was going to be back, but I did predict that Wilson will be re-signed. However, with McDuffie back in the mix, I'm a little not as confident in that prediction at this time. But the reason that I thought he would return, again, core special teams contributor like McDuffie, depth, someone you can rely on to start if needed. He filled in at Mike linebacker last season when Quay Walker was injured. Him being on the roster wouldn't prohibit Tyron Hopper from taking another step. By the end of last season, Eric Wilson was the fourth linebacker on the depth chart. And again, just that experience that he brings overall, and it's going to be a relatively inexpensive contract as well. Cornerback Robert Rochelle. I predicted he is going to be re-signed. Big reason, Packers are just really, really low on depth, both in terms of experience, in terms of just number of players at the cornerback position. So this is a low-risk move, right? You sign him to a minimal contract, minimal guarantees. If he competes, if he makes your roster, because he did play special team snaps the last few seasons, if he's able to compete and elevate the room in that regard, the bottom half of the roster, it's a win-win. You get those contributions on a short-term, inexpensive deal. But if he doesn't make the team, if he gets beat out by another player, then you cut your costs, you release them, and there's going to be minimal to no salary cap hit. So it just seems like a very low-risk signing for a position group that just has a ton of unknowns right now. Same thing with Corey Ballantyne. Again, special teams contributor, has defensive experience. That 2023 season, that back half of the year, they had to rely on him. And last summer, they were working him out as a slot cornerback as well. Not just playing the outside, but playing the inside. So you get versatility, you get experience, you get special teams experience. Again, not a contract that I expect to break the bank. You have a cornerback position with a ton of unknowns. I think it makes sense to bring him back as depth. And again, if things work out where he doesn't make the team, there's very, very little or no impact cap-wise for the Green Bay Packers. Defensive tackle TJ Slayton, my biggest reason why I don't think he's going to be back is this defensive tackle class, absolutely loaded. Tons and tons of talent along the defensive line. And when it comes to how the Green Bay Packers build their roster, how Brian Gutekunst goes about that process, drafting a young, inexpensive rookie, high-impact player versus signing a veteran who's has one primary role that he fills, just doesn't seem to mesh with how we've seen Brian Gutekunst go about filling his or building out his roster. Eric Stokes, I don't think he's going to be back. Big reason, I think he just gets more money elsewhere. He has the draft pedigree, he has the athleticism pedigree, has experience. I think another team just gives him more years and more money than the Packers would be willing. Josh Myers, similar situation. I think he gets more elsewhere. Packers have options on the roster as well to replace him. Sean Ryan, Elton Jenkins, Jacob Monk, all options already on the roster to take over at center. In addition to that, his play has been up and down throughout his career. Now, A.J. Dillon, I don't think he's going to be back either. One, biggest reason, the running back room is absolutely crowded. And when it comes to the role that the Packers were carving out for A.J. Dillon last summer, a little bit of that do-it-all, versatile role in the running back position, moving across, lining up at various parts of the formation, two running back sets in the backfield with Josh Jacobs, blocking ability. Chris Brooks emerged and really took control of that role. So you have a crowded running back room. You have a super deep running back draft class. You already have someone who emerged and filled a similar role. So I think A.J. Dillon is not going to be re-signed. Lastly, Andre Dillard. I said coin flip for this one, but I had him being brought back, being re-signed. Big reason, offensive tackle depth. It's Kadeem Telfort. It's Travis Glover. Dillard at least adds some experience to that room. In addition to that, we've seen Brian Gutekunst each offseason bring in a veteran offensive tackle to that room. There's Dennis Kelly, there's Rick Wagner, there's Jared Valdir, there's Andre Dillard. So I think if I had to guess, he's going to be re-signed. But again, it's a coin flip. If Brian Gutekunst feels there's an upgrade that's out there at the position to provide depth, I think he makes it. But again, experience, knows the system, was on the roster all last season. I'll coin flip, say Andre Dillard returns. All right, now let's talk about the trade market. Opportunities are there, specifically all the factors that go into that decision-making process. And options via trade for the Packers obviously dwindling, right? DK Metcalf to Pittsburgh, Max Crosby staying with the Raiders, Myles Garrett staying with the Browns. If there is a player that the Packers are going to take a swing on, the last potential option, we don't know if the Packers have shown interest or not, Cincinnati Bengals defensive end Trey Hendrickson. We haven't seen the Packers under Brian Gutekunst take a big swing via trade. We've seen them trade away big players, but not the other way around. And as he described after the season, there's obviously a lot of factors that go into that decision-making process. Gutekunst did add that he's willing, right, for the right player to take that swing, but there's a lot that goes into that decision-making process. And I'm not here to say right or wrong. Packers shouldn't have made a trade offer for DK Metcalf or should have or anything like that. I'm just here to examine what these other factors are that, again, are a part of the decision-making process to help provide a little bit of extra context. So it's not just the draft pick that you're parting with, right? You're not just giving a second-round pick and you get the player in return. There's a lot of other, costs, for lack of a better word, that come with making that deal if you're the Packers or the team acquiring a player. By giving up the draft pick, you're giving up an inexpensive 4-year rookie contract for a young, ascending player who's likely headed towards their prime. You're giving up on that because you're trading away a draft pick. In addition to that, there's a salary cap component, especially with these, big, high-profile trades. You're now acquiring a massive cap hit, and that player is likely on an expiring contract, which means you now have to give them a contract extension, which means you're putting a hefty amount of cap charges on your book for additional years. So the trickle-down effect of that is as you add all that salary cap to your books, both now and into the future, what's the trickle-down of how does that impact how you add to other position groups? Does it restrict your ability to re-sign some of your own, either current or future free agents because you have a large amount of cap space devoted elsewhere? What other salary cap maneuvers now have to be made, whether it's restructures, cuts, whatever it might be, to now fit that contract, that extension on your books moving forward, so the plan that you have for how you want to construct your roster during the 2, 3, 4 year windows that GMs have a lens and are looking through as they're building their team. How do you have to reshape things so you're not just completely wiping that clean and having to start from scratch? So again, there's a lot of factors beyond just why didn't you give up a second-round pick for that player? Why didn't you give up a third-round pick for that player? And again, not saying right or wrong, not saying the Packers shouldn't take a swing on these players, not saying that whatsoever. But as Brian Gutekunst told us, the things we've highlighted here are things that he mentioned as part of the decision-making process. I think it's important to at least acknowledge it and be mindful of it from a context standpoint. And the last thing he said, if you're going to give up high draft capital for a player, you better be right about them, right? Because you're giving up so much. You're giving up the draft pick, the inexpensive rookie deal, the young ascending player that you could draft with that draft pick, right? There's the salary cap space. What's the trickle-down effect to your roster construction this year and moving forward? Now, of course, on the flip side, you're getting a high-impact, established veteran player who you can drop right into your offense or defense, and you're going to get a high-level impact from them, right? So obviously you're getting something valuable in return. But as we look at how the Packers want to go about building the roster, again, right or wrong, indifferent, whatever you feel, that very much, everything just described, goes against the grain for them. And I think, again, as we have these conversations, as we see these reports, important factors to keep in mind. All right, lastly, before we get out of here, let's talk about positions need for the Green Bay Packers this offseason and who some of those top free agents are available at that position group. Let's start with cornerback. Obviously, the need here is twofold. The Packers appear to be at a crossroads at this position group. Jay Alexander could be cut, could be traded. And then if so, that leaves the Packers with Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine as your starters. You have to create competition there, right? You have to look to try to elevate your starting cornerback group. In addition to that, depth's needed, both from a number standpoint and an experience standpoint. Behind Nixon, behind Valentine, depth chart, it's Kamal Hadden, Kalen King, Caleb Hayes, Isaiah Dunn. Combined, that group, Isaiah Dunn's 116 defensive snaps over 4 NFL seasons, is the most. Starting caliber depth is needed, competition's needed, numbers are needed, experience is needed. This feels like similarly to the safety position we saw last year. I don't think quite to that extent, but similarly, we could see the Packers hit the reset button here to a degree, right? And that means going out. I think this is the position. I think there's a recipe available out there where this is a position in free agency where if we're going to see Gutekunst take a swing, I think it's here for the reasons mentioned. I think there's a mini reset coming at this position where you take a swing in free agency. You go out and you spend multiple draft picks on this position group because they are very much at a crossroads right now. And last season, while The cornerback room did a good job of limiting big plays from opposing offenses. The Packers ranked 31st in pass deflections. There weren't enough plays on the football being made. Keyshawn Nixon gave up a completion rate of 66%. Carrington Valentine gave up a completion rate of 82%. Even if you're holding pass catchers to 9-10 yards of reception as a boundary cornerback, which is a really good number, which is what Nixon and Valentine mostly did last season, if you're allowing a reception 3 out of every 4 passes that come your way, that's still a first down. Packers need more ball production. They need more disruptiveness in terms of the completion rate that's being allowed in the secondary. So this is a group that's absolutely going to have to be added to. And like I said, this is a really deep free agent class at the cornerback position. Packers have the, I think, flexibility salary cap wise, as we discussed, to go out there and make an addition, a fairly big one. So I think the recipe's there for them to take a swing at this position group specifically. And again, some of the big names to know: DJ Reed, Travarius Ward, Byron Murphy, Carlton Davis, Asante Samuel Jr., and Paulson Adebo. Next up, the defensive line. I mean, Brian Gutekunst at the combine, very straightforward, right? If we're going to accomplish our goals that we have this season, we have to get after the quarterback more consistently. Just something the Packers' 4-man rush last season did not win anywhere nearly consistently enough. And we saw the impact of that, the trickle-down effect of that, particularly against good opponents, the Eagles, the Vikings, Jared Goff and the Detroit Lions. Those offenses really picked apart the Packers' defense, their secondary, and that's what's going to happen when you're up against good, efficient quarterbacks, talented receivers, and you can't get after the quarterback. So you're giving these quarterbacks a clean pocket, time in the pocket to go through their reads, operate within the timing and the rhythm of the play. That's really putting your defensive backs in a bind when they have to consistently defend for 3-4 seconds every play. You're going to get picked apart, and that's what we saw. The Packers against better opponents have to get after the quarterback. Now, having said that, I don't know that free agency is going to be the path for them to finding that high-impact player. Reason I say that, this year's draft class along the defensive line, both tackle and end, absolutely loaded. Tons of talent available, and when it comes to a roster building, roster construction element for Brian Gutekunst, that's how he wants to build this team, right? If there's the opportunity where there's a ton of high-end talent for him to go out and pick in the draft, and like we just talked about, get an expensive 4-year rookie deal, a young ascending player towards their prime, versus devoting more salary cap space and dollars to a position group where you've done that fairly significantly with Kenny Clark, with Rashawn Gary. That just feels like the more likely path for the Packers in terms of really trying to make a big improvement at that position group. Now, it doesn't mean they aren't going to go out and surprise us and take a swing. That doesn't mean they won't find a depth piece to elevate the floor of each of those position groups to add competition. All very much in play. But like I said, for that reason, in terms of high-end talent taking a swing to really bring in an impactful presence, I feel like the draft is going to be the more likely path for the Packers. But nonetheless, some names to know: Josh Sweat, Hassan Reddick, Milton Williams, Malcolm Kuntz, Dio Adengbo, Chase Young, BJ Hill, a couple names at both defensive end and tackle to watch. When it comes to the offensive line, the need here is twofold. One, they have to improve the depth on this roster. We know the Philadelphia Eagles exposed starting defensive line units, but the Packers' depth along the offensive line was exposed during that playoff game when Elton Jenkins left the game. So improving that group, adding competition to it, perhaps some experience in free agency, going to be, one would think, on Brian Gutekunst's to-do list. You hope Jacob Monk, Kadeem Telfort, Travis Glover take steps forward, but banking on that, assuming that's going to happen, comes with obvious risks. So bringing in a veteran presence to compete with them, to hopefully elevate and raise the floor, to raise the competition in that group, makes a ton of sense for this Packers team. Again, the depth has to improve for this position group. And we've seen Brian Gutekunst over the years, particularly at tackle, bring in veteran, low-cost players to, again, help elevate that position group. There was Daniel Kelly, there was Jared Valdir, Rick Wagner. Last year was Andre Dillard. So again, we've seen the Packers go about that. Now, the other reason that the offensive line is in need this offseason is we look ahead to 2026. Rasheed Walker, Zach Tom, Sean Ryan are all free agents. Josh Myers is a free agent this offseason as well. But in terms of building, looking for your starters versus a plug-and-play veteran, again, I think that need, that specific need, is going to be more so tackled in the draft versus free agency. So when it comes to free agency and the Packers looking at the offensive line, I would look more towards depth options, right? Veterans who have experience, who can come in and, perhaps compete if there's a spot along the offensive line open. But more importantly, I think from what the Packers are looking for, elevate the depth, raise the competition, add some experience to the back end of that roster. Some names to know: Kevin Zeitler, Dalton Risner, Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, Brandon Scherf, Jedrick Willis, Ryan Kelly, and Coleman Shelton. A couple interior players along the offensive line, offensive tackles as well to know. Lastly, the wide receiver position. Finding that true wide receiver one, and the Packers need it. I think Brian Gutekunst, to an extent, has acknowledged that this offseason, but he's also said he believes there's players on the roster who can step up and fill that role. But the Packers need that presence. But as we've talked about on here before, I know we've had this discussion, I know I've written about it a lot. Finding that true number one presence via trade, via free agency, was never going to be a likely path for this team. For one, all the reasons we mentioned in our trade conversation, right? The draft picks are given up, the cap hit you're taking on, just all those different elements and factors that are in play. Two, there's just not a lot of those players available, right? It was DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, Devontae Adams, and just like that, all three of them have new teams, or T. Higgins' case staying with Cincinnati. They already are on teams or have new teams already situated. So that was never going to be the most likely path. Now, and again, I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent, that the Packers shouldn't have taken a swing, shouldn't have made the call, shouldn't have offered the draft pick, whatever it might be. But in terms of how they go about building a roster, those avenues just don't align, especially when there's just few options out there for this team. Elevating the play of this group, the most likely path always seemed to be infusing competition into it, right? We saw this kind of to a degree in 2023, right? You have Christian Watson, you have Romeo Doubs, you go out and you add Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Malik Heath to this Packers team, right? Raise the competition, raise the level of urgency, something Brian Gutekunst wants to see of that receiver room. And we really saw good play from that unit in 2023. I think that's the approach that they take here this offseason, whether it's in free agency with a veteran presence, whether it's in the draft, whether it's both. Because in the draft as well, there aren't those usual high-end players. The depth of the receiver position in this year's class isn't the same as we've grown accustomed to. So I don't know that you're going to find that true number one target in the draft either. So again, finding that presence outside of the building was always going to be a tall task. And the main reason why, limited options to go about in finding that player. The Packers roster construction approach under Brian Gutekunst doesn't necessarily jive with that as well. Again, right or wrong, but it is how things are situated. So infusing competition, again, whether it's free agency or the draft, to hopefully get more out of that group, to elevate that group, and someone steps into that wide receiver one role. Some of the options still out there in free agency: Chris Godwin, Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, Darius Slayton, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Joshua Palmer, and MVS. So there you have it, my friends. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for making it this far. And if you did, you might as well hit like. You might as well hit subscribe on the channel. I greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com. Download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. Tune in the rest of the week as we break down whatever moves are coming for the Green Bay Packers.